So now that we are recording, I do want to say once again, thank you so much for all of y'all that have tuned in. Looks like we've got about 10 folks in right now, and we'll see if we'll pick up some more participants as the talk goes on. But without further ado, let me go ahead and share my screen. So hopefully y'all will be able to see this. So let me know. Can everybody see that okay? Can I get a confirmation in chat from folks that y'all are seeing my screen now? You're seeing my PowerPoint. All right, got some confirmation there. Excellent. So I do have, as I said, the chat pulled up in a separate window. So I'll try and monitor that. As I mentioned just a second ago, I'll open up the floor at the end for questions, and I'll also have my contact information if y'all have anything you think of either during the talk or after the fact. But for now, let me get this popped up. And since by my watch we've got 12:02 and we've got a decent amount of ground to cover, I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. One of the beauties of online learning is that I get people tuning in from all over the place, so I'm never sure how familiar people are with me when they are tuning in. But for those of you that maybe this is your first time tuning into my Lunch and Learns, my name is James Murphy. I am the Agriculture and Natural Resources Agent for UGA Extension Rockdale County. And today I'm going to be giving a little talk on home mushroom gardening. So this is something I personally have had an interest with. As we'll talk about a little bit later, I've actually done a little bit of this myself. But a decent amount of this material I owe directly to Dr. Peter Hartel out of UGA, who actually led me through my initial training on mushroom gardening earlier this year. And so I'm going to try and translate some of his material in a way that, I feel like is through my own lens and maybe add to it. But I definitely owe him a great debt of gratitude for providing a solid basis for me to provide this info to y'all. So without further ado, we're going to get into some advice directly courtesy of Dr. Hartel, which this is sort of a word of warning or a word of safety, which is maybe one of the common things that comes up when discussing mushrooms. And the key here is that every year there are reports of people either getting gravely ill or potentially even dying from ingesting poisonous mushrooms. This is something that I think is often on the forefront of many people's minds when you think of foraging mushrooms rather than simply buying mushrooms from the grocery store, from a farmer's market. And so therefore, when dealing with mushrooms, we have to adhere what we're going to refer to as the rule. And it's a simple axiom to adhere to. And that rule is that you are never to eat any wild mushroom that you are not 100% confident in identifying. And that is simply because the risk is just not worth it. The potential reward for eating a mushroom that you're unsure of is that you eat a mushroom. It's not going to be enough for a meal. It's not going to sustain you long term, but the risk is anywhere from a mild poisoning, which could be vomiting, abdominal pains, headaches, anything in that realm, up to and including severe organ failure and death. And so that's why, as kind of a blanket statement, we want to advise you on the rule. The flip side of this, of course, is that because of the rule, there are people, perhaps yourselves after this talk, that are going to try to grow their own mushrooms, but then they will, be too paranoid or lack that confidence, and you're not going to want to eat the mushrooms because you're afraid of the rule. And so part of what we're going to try and do first before we actually talk about how to grow mushrooms is talk about how to adhere to the rule and how to work within that framework. Something else I want to have is sort of an addendum to that statement about the rule is a general disclaimer. I know we've got folks tuning in from outside of Georgia, so this advice is not necessarily one size fits all. Some of it is as far as the poison helpline, but as a general rule, our extension service is not going to identify foraged mushrooms for the general public. I've gotten calls about it in the past, and I'm sure I will continue to get calls about it in the future, but because of that risk that we mentioned on the previous slide, it's really just not worth it. My background is in entomology. I'm pretty good with insect identification, but mushrooms are an entire new domain of life with their own particular quirks and identifying characteristics, and I am not trained, nor are the average agent trained in a meaningful way to identify these fungus. If you are intending on doing it, and congratulations, I just saw in chat, Brian, on getting your certification in mycology. So, you know, maybe everybody can hit him up after this talk for identification. But if you are intending to eat foraged fungus and you need help identifying it, I would say consult with a trained mycologist. I know I believe it's the U.S. Forest Service has a pretty good guide on common forest mushrooms, but I would also recommend sort of in-person resources up to and including the Mushroom Club of Georgia or similar state or university level mycological organizations, because they're really going to have that training and knowledge base that we here at Extension are going to lack. And they may be able to provide you with that. I imagine, though, with similar caveats on potential risk that one takes on with ingesting anything that's been foraged from the wild. So now that we've covered kind of blanket disclaimer, let's get into Mycology 101 and sort of what is a fungus. So as I mentioned earlier, fungi are their own distinct kingdom. They are distinct from plants and animals despite having some similarities between the two. For me, that's one of the things that got me interested in mycology, is because, you know, I've studied insects for a large portion of my life. I've always been interested in ecology, in plants and animals, but fungi were basically aliens living on Earth, as far as I could tell. You know, they didn't adhere to some of the same rules that one might think of when looking at plants or animals. And so I always thought they were kind of fascinating for, you know, sort of their life cycles and the role they play in the environment. Scientists estimate, I think it was a recent study, that there was around 2.2 to 3.8 million estimated species worldwide. Leslie has also commented in chat that there are some great ID groups on Facebook, so Georgia Mushrooming and Mushroom Hunters of North America. So thank you for pointing those out. I think those are, you know, great additional online resources. Some more info on fungi, though. So they are heterotrophic, meaning that they don't produce their own food like plants. That means they have to consume things from the environment. And so in terrestrial environments, fungi are really going to be the primary decomposers. That means they are responsible for breaking down organic material and sort of cycling those nutrients. And again, because they're heterotrophic, they're not going to be photosynthetic. The basic unit of fungal growth is what we call a hypha. So these are tiny, they're microscopic, anywhere from 2 to 10 micrometers in size. However, the macroscopic structures, so what we can actually see with the naked eye of fungi, can vary wildly. So these can be things that are sort of hyphae or hyphal structures in something like a simple mold or mycelium that you might be able to see growing underground. To, you know, massive above ground fruiting bodies. And so perhaps one of the most famous ones, colloquially known as the humongous fungus, is a clonal colony of Armillaria solidipes that's estimated to be around 9,000 years old and covers an area of around 3.5 square miles in the Malheur National Forest out in Oregon. So this is an example of what those look like. You can imagine underground is this massive contiguous mass that is spread throughout this region, which really, again, I think contributes to the sort of otherworldly or alien-like nature of fungi, that they can be ancient and encompass massive areas in ways that are very different from other forms of life. So if you've joined this talk today, maybe you've already answered some of these questions for yourself, but I think a lot of folks are curious as to why would one want to grow mushrooms. So here are a few of the kind of basic pros and cons, and you may kind of already have some of these for yourself. So on the pros side, if you are a grower, if you're a farmer, mushrooms can be a great crop to help augment sales for what would be the off season. So a lot of times the cold season. This is especially true if you participate in something like a CSA and you're limited to certain cool season crops, maybe some root veggies or things like kale or other leafy greens. This can be another way to kind of take an additional step to augment what you have on offer and to add another potential revenue stream. So for growers, this is something we like to advise. If you've got the space and the know-how to set it up, you might want to give this a try. Mushroom farms or mushroom gardens can also be in some ways less intensive than traditional gardens. As far as maintenance and pest control, mushroom gardens are very feast or famine in some cases in terms of labor, but also in yield. So there can be long periods of time in between periods of brief, frantic activity to get a lot of stuff done in a short amount of time. But in that meantime, you can tend other things in the garden. You can turn your attention to other things while they kind of do their thing. Mushrooms are also an excellent meat substitute for people that are trying to reduce or eliminate meat consumption. That's something I've certainly tried to do for myself recently, whether for ethical or for health reasons. If you're into the kind of low meat lifestyle or meat-free lifestyle, but you're not completely sold on some of the other products, or maybe things like tofu or tempeh aren't quite your thing, mushrooms are a great way to get that sort of meaty taste and texture and a lot of the same health benefits without necessarily having to go in a completely different way. So some of the cons briefly we'll cover. Depending on how you go about it, mushroom gardening will require the purchase or rental or borrowing of certain specialty equipment. This is true for any kind of gardening, but if you're already a gardener, you may still have to buy some specialty things. For shiitakes, which we'll cover first, sourcing and preparing the wood for inoculation is both time and labor intensive. So we mentioned that overall mushroom gardens are a little less intensive, but during that time, you're going to be playing the role of a lumberjack. And wood is heavy, it is unwieldy, and it again is going to require some specialty tools and know-how to deal with. I will also say shiitake mushrooms, in my personal opinion, are one of the poster children for delayed gratification in gardening. They are certainly up there with fruit trees, I would say, in terms of the time between sort of planting, as it were, or inoculation properly, as we'll talk about, and actually reaping those rewards. So if you're impatient, if you're a fan of instant gratification, just know going into this that you're going to need to develop those skills in order to be successful. So before we go any further and we delve into some of the practical techniques for setting up a mushroom garden, I do want to briefly mention some options for total beginners or total novices, and that is in the form of retail kits. I just want to say, these things are available online or from various retail outlets. And I would recommend these to folks that maybe you just have a baseline interest, or maybe you leave this talk today armed with some knowledge, but you're not sure you really want to dive in the deep end. I would absolutely recommend looking into some of these kits. I know folks personally that have ordered some of these online and they've had decent results come out of them. However, I will say not all these kits are going to be made equally. So I would say, buyer beware, do your research. If at all possible, talk to the sellers and try and get a good idea of what's actually on offer, because, you're buying a living organism, so you can imagine just as if you were buying a pet or if you were buying a plant, you want to know exactly what you're buying and if it's going to be suitable for the environment and the space that you have for it. So I would absolutely recommend these, but just do a little bit of research and try and figure out if what you're getting is going to be reputable and is going to be what you're really looking for before just committing to buying the first thing you find on Amazon or eBay or Etsy. So now that we've kind of passed that stuff, let's dive into our first major mushroom at hand. And this is the shiitake mushroom, Lentinula elodes. And so shiitake is actually a Japanese word. It's two characters, as you can see there. The first shi, meaning tree, and the second take, meaning mushroom. This is the most popular mushroom grown in Japan that has sort of a mild, meaty flavor. I think once upon a time, these were perhaps a bit more coveted. These were, I think, definitely a bit pricier on the market, but now that they've gained a bit more popularity here in the States and there are more people producing them, that price has come down a little bit. But that is to say that shiitake have a long history of cultivation. So they have a very long history of cultivation, and some of the earliest records date back to China in 1209 AD, describing actual written cultivation methods. And so you can imagine if 1209 we have written records, likely their cultivation dates back much earlier than that. It's just records may not have survived or may not have been written down in quite the same way. But suffice to say, people have learned how to cultivate this and have been doing it for quite some time. Another interesting factor, and this is true for many mushrooms and is one of the other reasons that I perhaps could have put on that pros and cons slide, is that there are some studies claiming additional medicinal qualities for mushroom or fungal consumption. And so in particular, I've highlighted one here that I just found off of searching PubMed that talked about boosting immunity by regular consumption of mushrooms. And so you can kind of take this with a grain of salt. You know, I'm not a doctor, I am not a dietitian, so I'm not here to evaluate that. I think at the bare minimum, they are decent from a dietary perspective, but I would not necessarily endorse the consumption of mushrooms as a replacement for any other medical advice, if that makes sense. So now we're going to circle right back around and we're going to talk about following the rule for our shiitake. So I mentioned, you know, we have to put that out there at the start. You know, we have to mention the rule. But now let's actually talk about how we follow it so you can be 100% certain in what you've cultivated and you can be confident when it comes time to harvest that you can eat what you've produced and you're not going to be worried about getting in trouble with it. So here's some of the things that you need to look for, and we're going to go through these step by step with some better images in just a second. So first, our shiitake, a mature shiitake, is generally going to be medium to large, so generally over 2 inches, though they can be a bit smaller depending on the state of maturity. And these are going to be growing specifically on wood. These are what we call saprophytic or saprophyte fungi. The cap is usually going to be a bit hairy. This can depend on sort of individual variety and environmental conditions, but this is something else you should certainly look for on that cap. The cap will be convex, which is to say our typical kind of umbrella-shaped cap. It's going to bend downwards rather than bend upwards, and so this is another easy way to differentiate it. Underneath that cap, you will see gills, and so not all mushrooms have gills, and you can kind of see them here in this image, but they are this structure that surrounds that stipe or stem up underneath the cap, and this is where spores will actually be produced and distributed. A veil will usually be present, especially on our younger mushrooms, and you should be able to maybe see the remnants of it on our mature mushrooms. Another characteristic of that stem or stipe is that it will be bare. It may be a bit hairy or warty, but you're not going to have a structure called an annulus or a ring, which we will again illustrate a little bit later. And one final characteristic that I think is very important, especially with differentiating from one of our more dangerous mushrooms that can crop up in these same situations, is what we call a spore print. So I just mentioned that our gills are going to be the site or the source of our spore production. So when you take these caps and you place them on a contrasting surface and leave them for a period of time, anywhere from a few hours up to a day, and then remove them, you should be left behind with what is a plainly white print of spores that have been released from those gills. And so this is an excellent way to determine against other species what type of mushroom you have based on a quick visual inspection. But again, when we're following the rule, it's critical that you have this entire suite of characters together rather than just, you know, a couple of them to really have that full 100% confidence. So here's some quick illustration of those characteristics. So here again, we show that convex hairy cap. You can very plainly see those hairs right here on the image on the left with that arrow pointing to them. You may not see these in shiitakes you get at the grocery store. I certainly don't see them quite as much. They may come off during cleaning or processing, but when they actually emerge, you're likely to see some of those along with some warts. Over here on the right, we see our gill serrations, and so you can see those gills are irregular and they have some differential kind of appearance to them. They're not all regular, and they all, you know, have sort of an individual look to them. Here's a look at that veil that I mentioned. You can see that it connects to the stipe when the mushrooms have not fully opened, when they are not quite fully mature. There is a veil that connects the cap to the stipe. And over here on the right, you can see up in the top right, I guess I should say, an illustration showing that annulus structure that we mentioned. So that is a ring that is left behind on the stipe. That's actually a remnant of that veil connection to the stipe itself. And you can see here we've got some fully opened shiitakes and they are missing. There's an absence of a ring there. So that's another important characteristic to see, especially compared to one of the ones that we'll see a little bit later. And here's just a quick illustration of that white spore print. So the image on the right there is actually one that was done when we were out at a mushroom training, and we were out there for, you know, a good few hours, but those were cut that morning and set on top there, and you can clearly see that white print, and the same is true for the left, and in the center here, that nice bright white coloration indicating a definitive shiitake, assuming you have those other suite of characters as we just discussed. So when you're growing your mushrooms, I do want to mention a few other species to be on the lookout for, just so, again, we can be in good adherence to the rule, but generally speaking, these are going to be ones that look fairly different from shiitakes, so I don't suspect that there's going to be any confusion. But it's just something that I want to make you aware of, that if you end up going this route, you should kind of know what you're looking for. So the first one is Trametes versicolor, or our turkey tail, so named for its turkey tail appearance. You can see there in that bottom left image. This is a very common saprophytic fungus. If you are a fan of forest walks and you take any time looking along the forest floor, you are very likely to see these growing. Unlike our shiitake, these are polypore fungus, so they do not have gills. Rather, it's going to look more like maybe a styrofoamy type appearance underneath, so there's actually going to be pores. This is not a poisonous mushroom. However, it is generally considered inedible. There's anecdotal or rather I should say just anecdotes that I've seen of people, you know, maybe processing this and turning it into teas and things like that. I have never tried it, but it is not poisonous, but it is simply just not going to be as palatable or edible as our shiitake. Another one to look out for, this is Exidia, sometimes referred to as black jelly or black witch's butter. This is another common one that you'll often see within the first year of growth after your initial inoculation. It's characterized by this black gelatinous brain-like cluster. It is again not poisonous, however it is edible depending on your tolerance for weirder textures because it is a bit more gelatinous and a bit more jelly-like. I personally will say there's a different genus from Asia that is quite popular that I was introduced to when I spent some time over in China a few years back, and now one of my fellow agents actually in DeKalb County, she is Chinese and she's quite a fan of it as well. She's cooked it for us a few times when my wife and I have spent some time visiting her. So it's a total texture thing. Some people love it, some people hate it. I happen to really love it. So if you happen to get some, you may be intrigued in giving it a try. Another sort of darker, funkier looking fungus is hypoxylon, also known as oak canker. So this is another common one. Glad to see Brian's a fan of the jelly fungus as well. I think somebody's got to sing its praises. So hypoxylon canker, this is one that, unlike our jelly fungus, is going to be much more crusty, a bit more like charcoal with sort of a powdery exterior, and that it's going to look a bit like dried tar. This is another one that's not poisonous. However, I don't think anybody would be tempted to eat this one. I think it's really just does not fall into the territory of something that is either appetizing or truly palatable, but your mileage may vary. However, it is not, strictly speaking, poisonous. And now we get to one that is a potential problem child. So this is Galerina marginata, also known as the funeral bell. And I think that common name alone with my scary red text should be enough to inform you that this is one that we do have to be careful of. Off the bat, though, I do want to lay some fears at rest in that this is typically rare in our region, generally not seen with too much frequency. However, it's not impossible. As far as identifying features, it is also brown, and it is also saprophytic. It does grow on logs like shiitake, and it is deadly poisonous. So this, the Galerina contains amatoxins. So this is the same type of toxins you would find in Amanita. One of the species I had on that first slide about the rule, the destroying angel, again, a very scary name for a very scary mushroom. And this is one that can cause you all kinds of problems. Deadly Galerina, more common. Yes, thank you, Brian. But yeah, so upon ingestion, one can expect severe abdominal pain, vomiting, and diarrhea from anywhere from 6 to 9 hours. And then from there, moving into compromised liver function, gastrointestinal bleeding, coma, kidney failure, or even death, usually within a week if left untreated without intervention. And so you can see why we really encourage folks to be careful and adhere to the rule. But here's how we follow that rule in comparison to our shiitake, and again, why we encourage folks to be aware of these characteristics, both so they can avoid danger, but also eat their crop with confidence. And so a quick comparison here, shiitakes are generally going to be larger than funeral bells or the deadly Galerina that are going to be on average much smaller, usually less than 1.5 inches in diameter. Our funeral bells are going to be smooth. They're not going to have any of that hair or those warts that you're going to find on shiitakes. As I mentioned earlier, there is no annulus on our shiitakes, whereas you can clearly see one on that funeral bell left over from where the veil separated from the stipe. And another key way, we go back to that spore print. So the shiitake is going to have a white spore print, and the funeral bell is going to have a brown spore print. So when you get your first crop after gardening, it may be worth it for your own peace of mind to just run a spore print, make sure it comes back white, and then you can be assured that what you're eating is correct. I do want to do a quick note on competition here because this is a concept that I think is important for all kinds of gardens, but especially for mushroom gardens because the competition is often microscopic. And so it's not something that you can really see, and it can be harder to anticipate if you don't know what you're trying to anticipate. So just like other gardens, in order to get a harvest of desirable organisms, you have to minimize competition from undesirable organisms. So this can be both other fungi as well as bacteria, insects, all manner of things could potentially mess up your gardening practice if you're not putting your garden together or preparing your garden as effectively as possible. So for this reason, we encourage you to imagine your mushroom substrate like a garden bed. You want it properly prepared to reduce the number of weeds, if that makes sense. Though we're not truly dealing with weeds, we're not dealing with other plants, we are to be dealing with competing organisms just like in a garden space. And so for that reason, you want to anticipate that and deal with them effectively. And then for that reason, we really recommend that you only are using fresh logs for your shiitakes, or if you're using, or if you're growing other mushrooms, that you pasteurize your substrate. I will say it's not strictly necessary. However, it's going to increase your odds long term that you're not going to have an infection from competing organisms that could completely waste all your time and effort. So you want to grow shiitake. Well, here's the basics of what you can expect to need. So we just talked about how we should treat our space or our substrate just like a garden bed. And indeed, the same concept holds here. The first thing that you're going to need is an appropriate space. Just like you would need a space for a garden, you're going to need a place for your mushrooms. So this space should ideally mimic a forest floor, because this is the natural environment for our mushrooms. So in this case, we're looking for something that is part to full shade, because this is going to be the natural environment where these mushrooms would flourish. However, just because it's shaded doesn't mean it should be completely covered. It needs access to moisture. This is going to be absolutely crucial, because just like other organisms, mushrooms need that moisture. And if your logs dry out, if they don't get sufficient irrigation, especially over hot, dry summer months, then they're not going to be successful in fully inoculating, colonizing, and then fruiting. You may consider placing your garden on top of an inert substrate like concrete, because this can again help with competition, so you don't have secondary inoculation or infection with organisms from the soil. However, if you don't have the resources or the space to pour a concrete slab or something similar, that's totally fine. However, you can make use of old spaces. You know, when we did these at the U Garden in Athens, they had placed all of their mushrooms on top of what used to be an old sheep barn. And so they knocked down the barn and they left the concrete slab there. And it was an excellent place to get these elevated up off the ground without necessarily having to do any major renovations. You will, of course, need a source of inoculum. So there are various sources of these online. For Georgia, you're going to be wanting to look for what we call WW or WR strains. WW will be warm weather, or WR would be wide range. So WW, WR, these are recommended, but depending on your region, you may want to look for cool weather. If you're a little bit further north, then you may want to look for something that thrives a little bit better in cooler weather. However, if you're down here in the south or southeast, cool weather strains may not do as well, just because they're not going to tolerate that hot summer that we get. You can use either sort of a mixed grain substrate, one that's already been inoculated and is ready to go, or another popular means of inoculation is also wood dowels that have been inoculated and already have some mycelial growth, as you can see here in this bag here that I pulled this image from offline. I would say with the dowels, I've not personally used them. I've only used kind of the mixed grain substrate. Just make sure that whatever dowels you purchase are going to be the same size as your drill bit, which we'll discuss in just a second. So of course, now that you've got your space and your inoculum, you're going to need some logs. So I would recommend hardwood exclusively for our shiitakes. And really for this, what you're going to be looking for, the most ideal would be oak. So if you have to take down an oak, you have no other option, then I would say utilize that. But otherwise, oak is kind of it's a valuable timber. It's a nice landscape tree, and chances are you aren't going to want to cut one down just for the sake of mushroom growth, even though you may be able to source it from somewhere else. But if you're going to cut something down yourself, if you've got property, or maybe you know somebody that's got property, here in the Southeast, I would much more recommend sweet gum, because it is very common, and even though it's perhaps not quite as good in oak, it doesn't provide the similar characteristics, or doesn't quite provide all the same characteristics. It is readily available, and it is 90% as good as far as a reliable substrate for mushroom inoculation. For overall length, I would utilize a chainsaw and try and get these fairly uniform to anywhere from 4 to 6 feet in length. Really, it's kind of whatever is up to you. If you want super massive mushroom logs, got a question about pecan wood. So I think you could use pecan wood. Again, this would be something that you would be cutting down fresh. So not something that's been felled, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But if you're taking down an old orchard or something like that, and you've got an abundance of it, you may be able to make that work. For varieties of oak, I don't think it really matters. I think white oak is usually preferred, but I think either would probably be fine. Oh, okay, perfect. Y'all are taking down an old orchard. So yeah, I will check on that for you and make sure. But I'm fairly certain it would be just fine. I think any hardwood would be suitable for this. So another note on our logs, that we want to make sure we don't have any splits, or full bark coverage is actually going to be preferred here. So you can see in this image, the second one from the left wouldn't be as good, because basically all that's going to allow is greater transpiration and greater potential for infection from outside organisms. If you have a large amount of bark that's been peeled off, this is going to let that wood again dry out much easier, and in your mycelium, as it colonizes in there, needs that moisture and needs that protection. So if you can avoid logs like this, you might want to repurpose those, or maybe cut that one in half and only use the smaller bottom half. When we talk about harvesting logs too, we usually recommend folks do this in the winter time. When we went out and did this, it was February, so it was still fairly midwinter for us here in Georgia. And the reason for this is really twofold. So for one, you're going to have your nutrients concentrated in your trunks. So the trees are going to have all of their nutrients in that sapwood. Everything is going to be held on there. So you're going to have the highest concentration of potential nutrients for your mushroom inoculation. The second thing is, again, many of these are going to be sort of cooler temperature loving organisms, and higher temperatures can really disrupt their metabolic processes, their establishment processes, or it can just encourage infection by other environmental organisms. And so that's why we say, if you're going to do this, try and do it in the winter time, because that's about the best time to get going. I would also advise against scavenging dead logs or anything that has been felled for longer than, say, a week or two, just because how rapidly these logs become colonized by competing organisms, and it will make it that much harder for your colony, your desirable colony, to get established and outcompete those other organisms. For actual inoculation, you will need some tools. So as I mentioned earlier, options vary here. In my experience, what we used is an angle grinder, which I think is great because you get very high RPM, very high torque that allows you for very quick successional cuts, or successional drills rather. You can get away with either a cordless or a corded power drill. However, depending on how many you're setting up, it can slow down your process. With either the drill or the angle grinder, I would absolutely recommend using a bit with a stop collar. So this is basically just going to be an enlarged piece of metal that's going to be outside the rotational diameter or the cutting diameter of your drill bit, that when you press into the surface of the log will stop it from penetrating. This way you're going to get a uniform diameter as well as a uniform depth for each and every single one of your cuts, and you're not going to have to spend as much time trying to eyeball it and get it exactly the same. And these stop collars can be had relatively inexpensive. You will also need, if you are going the angle grinder route, to get an adapter to accept that drill bit. But again, these can be had inexpensively. You'll just have to source one and make sure it's going to work with your angle grinder. For actual inoculation, I mean, you can go very old school with this if you'd like, and you could potentially do this entirely by hand. However, one of the items that we often recommend is to use an actual inoculator, so a hand style inoculator, and these come in either a thumb style that will sort of have, you know, it's a similar mechanism to clicking on a pen, or a palm style. So you're going to have a bit of a broader contact patch that's going to allow you to just press that little core of inoculated material into the hole that you have drilled. There are also mechanical ones that may, you know, have a bit of a hopper apparatus to them that will allow you to kind of do them in succession. I've never used one of these, but I'm aware of their existence, and it just depends on, you know, how much you feel like you need one, how much you're willing to spend. I think these palm style ones can be had relatively inexpensively, and they're mechanically simple, so there's sort of less to go wrong with them. If you're using dowels, you can either use a soft mallet or just go by hand and, you know, sort of press these in carefully and try and get those all established to a uniform depth. And really the idea here is just to try and get them as flush as possible with the wood if you can. So here's our general practice for how we actually prepare our hole. So you can see here, or prepare our log, I should say. So you can see here a picture. This is actually my wife and I when we were at the training back in this February. And the prescribed method for this by Dr. Hartel is basically, as you rotate around, that you're going to form what looks like kind of a diamond or maybe a checkerboard pattern. And this is effectively to account for the natural flow of nutrients through the sapwood, because nutrients generally are going to flow up or down very easily in a tree, but they're not going to flow sideways very easily. And then to sort of offset while maximizing your potential surface area for inoculation. And so, you know, Dr. Hartel was also happy to mention that you are not forced into this rigid structure. If you are at all interested in mushroom artwork in your inoculated logs, if you want to write your name in it, you certainly can. It's just not going to be the most efficient or most uniform way to go about it. But as you can see here in this diagram, we have basically a three-step process, starting with a row of holes drilled. You know, this is not to scale, but we can imagine that each one of these is anywhere between maybe 4 to 6 inches apart, and then rotating the log by about, you know, 3 inches or so, and then doing another row of offset holes. And so basically, so you end up, as you go across, having sort of a checkerboarded pattern, and just repeating this process until you've gone all the way across the log. So next, what you're going to do is you're actually going to use that inoculator. You're going to use either your hand inoculator, or you're going to plug your dowels into these holes, however works, and then you need to actually seal these up. And so what we did is we sealed these up using hot wax, and you can do this. I think we used water baths to basically warm these up. I imagine if you've got an old crock pot or something like that, you may be able to use a similar device to get this melted. Maybe even just like a hot pad in an old pan that you don't care about. But really for this, for sealing, again, the key is, so we're going to keep out competing organisms and we're going to keep in moisture. And so once we've inoculated, we want to keep a nice environment, a nice relatively clean and sealed environment, so we can give our newly established hyphae in there a safe space to get going, and so they don't have to deal with outside competition when they are in sort of that initial somewhat vulnerable state. So for the actual type of wax, I believe you could probably use anything that you have on hand that melts at a relatively low temperature, is unscented, uncolored, is what I would prefer. I don't know if the fungus has any preference, but that way you're not dealing with any potential chemical leaching or anything like that. And so for our demonstration, for our training, we use cheese wax. I know food grade paraffin is also supposed to be good, but I mean, say you keep bees and you've got access to a ton of beeswax, you know, maybe you could make that work also, but otherwise it's pretty expensive stuff, so it's probably not the best way to go. Another good practice, this is not 100% necessary, but it is a good practice if you are going to be a more analytical or a more comprehensive gardener. This is leaning more towards farming, I guess, is to have some labeling system. So using aluminum plant labels and using a staple gun to actually put those into the end of your logs will allow you to get a nice at-a-glance look at what you've inoculated with, what actual strain you've inoculated with, the date you've inoculated, what type of wood it's in, as well as, you know, the name of the person who did it if you have multiple people on the operation in case you need to chase somebody down who did something wrong. But this is all, you know, pretty optional. If you're just a home gardener, if you're just getting started, you may not need to label, but it is, I think, a best practice that I would advise. So the last thing you'll really need for growing shiitake is patience. So patience is a virtue. I mentioned earlier when we were talking about potential cons of mushroom growing is that shiitakes can take, I think, at a minimum, under ideal conditions, 6 months, 6 to 8 months, I would say, would be the very shortest window. But realistically, you're probably looking at a full year from inoculation to fruiting. And so if you are impatient, if you don't feel like you can do that, if you love mushrooms, but you'd rather just buy them at the store, maybe it's not for you. But if you've got the space and the willingness, you can certainly give it that time. Just know you're probably going to have to check on these because, as I mentioned, they are going to need some irrigation, especially in the hotter summer months. You may, if you're really handy and you've got it available, you could set up a drip irrigation system. The other end of that spectrum is you could just give it a little, you know, kind of spritz with a hose every once in a while. They don't need to be soaking wet, but you want to make sure that, you know, they get a little bit of moisture just to keep that going because you don't want them to completely dry out if we're not getting any rainfall. So an inoculated log can last for quite some time. You know, I would say probably 2 to 3 years tops. You may get, you know, several crops out of it, but generally speaking, after that first crop, it's going to start to degrade or diminish in quality over time. But you may get 2 to 3 harvests out of it in total, depending on how well it took. So how should you actually arrange your logs? So I think some folks may be limited to the image that we have over here on the left. And so this is what we would call kind of the Lincoln log or the log cabin look. So if you only have a small amount of space, this may be the only way that you can set it up, and that's okay. However, what we really advise is something that looks a little bit more like over here on the right, or a more sort of hybrid design, a sort of a laid down Lincoln log where they're sort of tessellated rather than built straight up. And the reason for this is you want to minimize rain shadow. I just mentioned not too long ago how important moisture is. And so you can imagine that on this sort of Lincoln log setup, the logs that are at the bottom of that are simply not going to get the same amount of moisture from rainfall or even irrigation if you had it set up as those on the top. Versus if you have the space to set up, you know, kind of a longer line, more almost trellised setup, or, you know, sort of long form kind of triangle tunnel setup as we have here, all of those are going to get much more even exposure to outside moisture, to ambient moisture. And so it would be preferable if you could set up your logs like on the right. However, I understand if folks are limited to only setting up what they have on the left. So this should be your final result. Effectively, you should, once you've done all your inoculating and sealing and arranging, you should have something that looks roughly like this. This image was actually taken from out at the U Garden, so this is where we did our training. And if you look closely, you can actually see all those individual little holes where we've drilled in and filled in, and you can see they're kind of opaque or kind of milky in color, and that's from the solidified wax that we've placed on top. You can see again our labeling here and all those individual labels on top of the logs that'll be helpful for you checking, you know, because again, this is going to take a long time. So it would be nice that you can expect when harvest should be coming up, that you can take a look at them. And you can also see here, I mentioned earlier, if you're handy, you're already a pretty experienced gardener and you have it on hand, a drip irrigation set up over top of this. So you could even set this up on a timer, have it, you know, run maybe 2 or 3 times a week. And you could go ahead and get a little additional moisture to those if you need during the hot summer months when they're really going to be transpiring. So alternatively, if that all sounds like a ton of work and you're really not sure if you're up for it, I would see if you might consider oyster mushrooms, which, as Brian pointed out earlier, you can also do these in whole hardwood, but you can also grow these in different media and different lignous material, such as straw. So oyster mushrooms, these are genus Pleurotus, though there are other genera that I believe are, the common name for them are still a variety of oyster, but these are Pleurotus ostreatus. So, and this is the pearl variety of oyster mushrooms. These are a medium to large, usually greater than 2 inches across in diameter of the cap at maturity, that are also saprophytic, just like our shiitake. So the scientific name, Pleurotus ostreatus, is Latin for sideways oyster, and that's because they grow sideways rather than growing upwards like our shiitake. These will grow outwards and sideways before turning upwards, and they have the appearance, I would say, roughly of an oyster shell, perhaps not as, you know, sort of craggy and bumpy. They're quite a bit smoother, but they have sort of an oyster shell appearance to the cap. And so you can see there's a lot of variation there too. They vary anywhere from sort of a normal concave appearance to a convex appearance, depending on the actual growth. The gills in this case are going to be what we call decurrent. So they will actually, the gills will descend onto that stipe or stem, which is also bare, just like our shiitake. There's no annulus, so it's again a nice distinctive factor. And our oysters as well will have a white spore print. So this is another great one if you decide to do some growth and you're at all concerned. Again, putting all these characteristics together is a great way to identify you've got exactly what you're looking for, even though in my opinion the Pleurotus are fairly distinct compared to some of our other varieties, and so even visually alone these might be easier to tell apart than just our shiitakes. I will say also there are several different species. So if you look online, especially if you're looking at kits or you're looking to buy inoculum, there's king, golden, blue, pink. All of these are in the genus Pleurotus. I have only had, I think, I've had some blues, not grown, but I've eaten some and they were quite good. So I don't know how much the taste really is differentiated between all of those, if they're all pretty similar, or if it's more of a visual thing, but just know that those are out there. So why would you want to grow oysters rather than shiitakes? So the first one I think that is quite obvious after we went through the whole shiitake growing process is that they're rather easy to grow. They taste great, but they also fruit quickly as opposed to our shiitake, which, as I mentioned, can take anywhere from 6 months, but more likely a year to actually get to fruiting. Oyster mushrooms can take as little as 4 weeks. I would say more realistically, probably 6 to 8, but 4 weeks is probably when you'll begin the fruiting process. Additionally, as I mentioned, they don't require logs and the accompanying process, so you can use straw instead. So as a reminder for folks who may not be familiar, straw is used for animal bedding. It's not going to have nutritional value. It's just going to be that sort of carboniferous lignin material, that you know, sort of tougher plant protein, that woody protein, versus hay, which is used for food. And so for that reason, straw is cheap, it's available, and it's a good substrate. So you can't just use the straw alone, or at least it's not recommended. You know, I've used straw alone that was not pasteurized, and I managed to get a good crop, but your mileage may vary. So I would recommend, again, from a competition standpoint, like we talked about earlier, to consider pasteurization. So pasteurization is different from sterilization, where sterilization kills everything. And so this would be something like an autoclave, where you want to eliminate all living material on this substrate. Whereas pasteurization is going to kill competitive organisms while it's going to leave some beneficial organisms behind. This is good because you're going to have an established bacterial community that's going to be sort of a buffer against other organisms, rather than having a completely blank slate where anything can come in and colonize, and again have an issue with colonization or competition, I should say. Pasteurization is going to be more of a happy medium. In order to affect this, you want to steam with hot water, or rather you can use steam or hot water. The key is to get your temperature to anywhere between 160 and maybe up to around 190, and you would need to keep it at that range for around an hour. And from there, you can remove it from the heat, allow it to cool down to 90 degrees, and then use that immediately. You know, go ahead and be ready to go at that point. Before doing this too, I would recommend flailing, cutting, shredding, mowing, mulching, whatever you can, in order to increase the surface area of your substrate, because that's going to allow for better colonization. By having more surface area, that's more nutrient area, that's more physical space for those hyphae to move into, to colonize. And so by shredding and mulching that up, you're going to provide a much better opportunity for those fungal hyphae and mycelia to get established. So what else will you need? Just like shiitake, you're going to need a source of inoculum. You can get this from various suppliers online. What we used was a ratio of ½ pound of inoculum to 10 pounds of substrate, but you know, this isn't an exact science, and you know, certain publications may tell you differently. This is just what we ended up using. You will also need some variety of container. So we used buckets. This image is actually my oyster mushrooms from my own back porch. These were from a pool chemical supplier that had been thoroughly cleaned. You know, you can clean these out, get rid of any chemical residue, and then punch holes in them. And these were used in kind of a double bucket setup. We inoculated them. One bucket was sat inside the other, inoculated, and then once they started fruiting, we flipped them over and put on top. And then you will need some kind of additional plastic bag to then put on top of that to maintain humidity. Another common way to grow these is to actually grow them within just a plastic bag that either already has perforated holes or will allow you to go in and punch holes in order to allow space for those fruiting bodies to emerge once you have full mycelial colonization. I think either would work fine. I think a lot of times commercially folks go for that hanging bag setup, but it depends on what you have available. I do know one thing they mentioned as well is I believe Publix gives away their icing buckets from the bakery. And so as long as you're fine cleaning out icing buckets, those are a free and available source of good sizable buckets that you could use to start growing your own mushrooms. So how to actually do this, you're going to pack that straw or whatever substrate you choose plus your inoculum. Then you guessed it, you're going to wait, but thankfully not as long as our shiitake. So roughly 3 to 4 weeks. For our spawn run, so this is when that inoculum is getting going, when the hyphae are spreading and forming a nice mycelial mat within that bucket. This is going to be up to the stage of what we call pinning, which you can see roughly in this image on the right. You're going to need a temperature of 75 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity around 80% and little or no light. So I would recommend here an outdoor closet or shed would probably be ideal. I got these started inside our house, or rather I got them started inside our office here before we started working from home around March. But they really took off when we put them in our outdoor closet, and then we kept checking on them until we started seeing this pinning growth. And then once you get to that pinning stage, you're going to change over to a fruiting cycle. And so from here, they can tolerate anywhere from 55 to 85 degree Fahrenheit temperatures. Actually, these fruit best when you're in that kind of transitional phase. So a lot of times spring and fall are going to be ideal for growth of these when you have cool nights, but relatively warm days, and then still nice high humidity, 80 to 90% humidity. The real key differentiator too here is light. So at this stage, once they reach fruiting, if they get anywhere from 10 to 12 hours of light, so you can imagine basically full sun that they would have in a garden, this is going to be ideal. Of course, here too, you may see issues with drying out or a drop in moisture. You don't necessarily need to water these, but a very light misting up underneath that bag will help keep your mushrooms nice and humid. So finally, what you can do is reap your rewards. So you can see here on the left, this is one harvest, a single harvest, and I got multiple bags of this size from our bucket setup. And so you can get a ton of these. I didn't actually weigh the final sort of wet weight of everything I got, but we made plenty of food with them and they were absolutely delicious. One thing I will recommend is don't forget to harvest. I'm gonna pick on my wife a little bit because this is her picture from underneath her desk. This is about the time we were forced to work from home because of COVID. I guess this would have been back in March or maybe early April, and she'd left her bucket there, and when she came back, this is what she found. Is it apparently her office was nice and warm enough, but also, you know, dark enough that those mushrooms found a way to pop on out. But we still ate them, and they were still quite good. So one thing I want to leave y'all with before we transition to the very end here, yeah, definitely a nice pile of spores there as well. So this is one of my favorite recipes. I've got a lot of mushroom recipes and I love to integrate them into my diet where I can because I'm a big fan of them, but this is one that I made actually just in the last couple weeks. But this is a vegetarian recipe that you probably could modify to make vegan if you'd like to, if you eliminate or substitute things like cheese or cream. Otherwise, and of course get something that would be a vegan sourced tortilla. But of course it doesn't have to be served on tortilla. You could put it on another grain like quinoa or something like that if you wanted to. But for this, I would recommend anywhere from 1 to 1.5 pounds of mushrooms, some type of oil, or I used canola cooking spray actually last time because it was less sort of mixing and dealing with it. Some type of tortillas, limes, taco seasoning. I make my own blend, but if you like the regular packaged stuff, that's totally fine too. Some type of crema, sour cream, or Greek yogurt. I like Fage, 20% fat Greek yogurt, but whatever you like is totally fine as well. Red cabbage, I like for a nice color contrast and for some crunch. If you like iceberg lettuce or you like radicchio, again, that's totally up to you. And then other optional taco toppings, so pickled or fresh onions, cilantro, jalapeno or serrano peppers if you like it spicy. If you like it even spicier like me, maybe you'll enjoy some habaneros or even some ghosts, and then something else additional like guac or cheese. So to make these, preheat to 400, slice those mushrooms up, lightly coat them in oil and put them on a foil-lined baking sheet. Bake for around 15 to 17 minutes, and then take them out, kind of swirl them around, stir them around, and coat them liberally with that taco seasoning before putting them back in the oven to broil for around 3 to 5 minutes. And then assemble those cooked mushrooms on warm tortillas. Additionally, you can, again, top them with whatever else you like, but that's just kind of my personal recipe. So with that, I can open up the floor to questions. I know we're just slightly over time, but I appreciate you all sticking with me. I will say also, let me go ahead and stop sharing real quick, and I want to pull out, as I said at the top, or I think I mentioned it at the top, this is a survey that is important for our reporting standards. So if y'all could fill this out, I would really appreciate it. It helps me with demographics. It helps me, sorry, I responded just to you, Arun. Let me put this to everybody because it automatically does that. So that survey link is in chat there. If you wouldn't mind filling it out, I would really appreciate it. To your tip there, Brian, as far as not storing them in plastic bags, I don't even think they lasted through the day. I'm pretty sure we cooked them that night, but I do appreciate you pointing that out. Because, you know, I'm sure as you'll see, like the mushrooms that you get even at the grocery store have perforations in that plastic. So they'll have little holes in there because you're exactly right. You want to have some exchange of humidity and moisture. So with that, as I said, if we have any other questions, I can certainly take them. Otherwise, I greatly appreciate y'all coming out today, tuning in today, and I will be posting the information for next month's Lunch and Learn, hopefully in the next week or so. Thank you so much, Trish. Appreciate you tuning in.
All right, I'm unmuting myself too. Thank you very much. This was excellent. You did a great